The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Titans of Nuclear podcast. I'm Phoebe Lind, and today we have Ted Nordhaus as our very special guest. He is the founder and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute. Ted, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Just to dive right in, tell us a little bit about how you got started. We'll start at the beginning. Where'd you grow up?
Wow, that's a long time ago. I've been at this for a long time. But I spent the first, kind of probably half of my career in the environmental movement, really, in a lot of cases, doing real kind of grassroots work, knocking on doors, running campaigns, that kind of thing. Spent some time as a pollster for environmental groups. And in the early 2000s, with a kind of number of other people, I helped launch a thing called the Apollo Project, which was really kind of like, in some ways, kind of like sort of version 1.0 of the Green New Deal. It seems a little kind of quaint now. We were calling for $300 billion over 10 years to invest in a clean energy economy. I wasn't a big kind of nuclear guy, didn't know that much about nuclear energy at the time. And a lot of the focus on that was just, wind and solar, kind of bringing clean energy, manufacturing jobs to America to kind of, and this was all right after 9/11. So there was a big focus on energy independence and kind of getting off of oil because it was funding terrorists and things like that. So I started that in the early 2000s. Like I said, I knew sort of environmental politics really well. And it was this kind of very kind of different approach to dealing with climate change, at that time. And again, this was a long time ago. So, we say things now that seem like really like conventional wisdom, like climate change is fundamentally a technology problem. But actually, the environmental community itself did not look at the problem that way at the time. It thought that climate change was just like a big air pollution problem, and we would solve it the same way that we had solved problems of, smog and sort of more conventional environmental problems. You would just sort of like the EPA would write a regulation and tell everyone to sort of reduce their emissions, and they would do it sort of, however they did it. Energy efficiency, some renewable energy, some pollution control on the end of the pipe, that kind of thing. So that was really the the sort of mental model or paradigm for climate change. When I started really kind of engaging the issue in the way that sort of we've been at it for, almost 20 years now. So the interesting thing was this big, exciting, new, innovative idea. It is now sort of the kind of conventional wisdom in the environmental community. But at the time, it was kind of heretical. And so we had this coalition, we had some labor unions, we had some sort of progressive kind of groups that weren't really environmental groups. And we start taking this idea around to all the big environmental groups, and they're kind of like, yeah, not interested. We've got our program here, just going to do an international treaty, a cap and trade program for emissions, and we're going to solve the problem. They were very, very confident that they knew exactly what to do. So we got really frustrated. I with a guy who probably some of your listeners know, who's kind of gone on to do some very different things since then, named Michael Schellenberger, wrote an essay in 2004 called "The Death of Environmentalism," which was kind of like a pre-Twitter social media call out of the entire environmental movement for just abjectly failing on climate change. And it was already clear, even then, that this sort of environmental community's agenda on climate change was not succeeding. They'd made no progress. Emissions had just been kind of going up they were still going up at the time in the US. They were rising very rapidly globally, especially as China was industrializing. And the environmental community insisted that, they knew what they were doing and they had this all kind of covered. But, it was obvious even in 20 years ago that this wasn't the case. So we write this thing. It was kind of like, went viral, kind of one of the early internet things that went viral. Everybody wrote about it, talked about it, went all over we self-published it on this little website that was the Breakthrough Institute before there was really an institute at all. It was kind of this internet media sensation, like people, even in the environmental groups. It's interesting because it came out right before the 2004 election. And we had interviewed the leaders of all the big environmental groups, and they were all very confident that John Kerry was going to win the election, and then we would go do this cap and trade bill. And so, I think everyone, on the left, including in the environmental community, was really shocked when W. Bush wins re-election, and there was a sort of a brief window for kind of introspection on the left and in the environmental community, right as we had self-published this essay. And so it just kind of hit at exactly the right time for a bunch of people to go like, what the hell are we doing here and why isn't it working? And so like literally even in the big environmental groups, there were literally like people were organizing reading groups to like read this essay and talk about it and whatever. And there was a big debate and all of that. So that's sort of where the present sort of iteration of Ted Nordhaus and really where the Breakthrough Institute starts. And we spent a bunch of years, really a decade after that, going like, okay, so we know that this thing that the environmental community is not doing isn't working. And we have this idea that a sort of technology-centered, public investment-focused approach we think would be better, but we didn't really know what that really meant. And so we spent a lot of years sort of both kind of looking at the sort of policy and sort of what the problem was. A few years later, we published like the first paper, sort of kind of white paper that we ever published a few years later was called Fast, Clean, and Cheap, which really kind of said like, again, this is a technology problem. We need to cut this sort of Gordian knot where, the idea is that by regulating fossil fuels, you would make them more expensive with a price on carbon or a carbon, cap and trade program. And then that's how you would get the clean energy. And we're like, no, actually, we're living in this world where, at the time it was almost 7 billion people. Now it's 8 billion people. A lot of them are really poor. They need to consume way more energy. They can't actually afford fossil energy in a lot of cases at the price that it costs today. So you really have to make clean energy cheap. You can't solve climate change by making the dirty energy expensive. So, and that's really like everyone now says, make clean energy cheap. That's what we're all trying to do here. But, we kind of invent the term. It's literally invented at the Breakthrough Institute. And I think that paper is the first place where it's ever actually, those words are like literally written. So we do, and we're looking at energy technology, and we're kind of like, this is an energy technology challenge. The clean energy is too expensive to do all the things that everyone wants it to do to deal with climate change and lots of other problems. And we have this idea that you need sort of public investment and you need government to accelerate that innovation challenge. again, we're still kind of pretty much focused on, I think we kind of mentioned advanced nuclear and nuclear energy for like maybe the first time in that Fast, Clean, and Cheap paper, but we're still mostly focused on renewable energy. And it's not until a few years later, as we're kind of diving deeper into the various sort of pathways to get lots of cheap, clean energy, that we start like looking at nuclear energy pretty seriously. We really kind of start looking at nuclear for a couple of different reasons. We're having these debates with the environmental movement. And so there's sort of two debates that we're in the middle of, where we're kind of pushing against what is the sort of conventional wisdom. And the first is there was this idea at the time that like you could mostly solve climate change with energy efficiency. And if you went back, there were like these big like McKinsey studies that were like, they had this McKinsey cost curve, and it showed all of this sort of below cost energy efficiency that would like allow you to very cheaply address climate change and deeply cut emissions. And we were really skeptical of that sort of right from the start. And then the second was this idea that kind of, again, it's like the whole discourse has shifted, but really the entire environmental movement was like convinced that you would just put a price on carbon and then you would let markets solve the problem. It was very, what people call today neoliberal. But this was literally like even all the big lefty liberal environmental groups were all like, Bill McKibben and Van Jones and all the kind of the environmental left was like, put a price on carbon, global price on carbon, the markets will solve it. And we were like, we don't think it's going to work like that. We were kind of looking at what the track record was in terms of how sort of modern economies had actually been reasonably successful at reducing their emissions, had done it. You kind of, as anyone who's looked at this, you kind of keep coming back to the same places again and again. It's France and Sweden, and there's a handful of these places. And we got interested in them because we're looking at them and we're like, well, mostly they're not doing this with energy efficiency. They're actually doing it on the supply side by just basically, replacing fossil fuel with clean. And they're not doing it sort of with a regulatory or a pricing or a market-based scheme. They're doing it with just sort of direct public investment in energy infrastructure. And so we're kind of like, aha, we have our sort of proof of concept here. We're right, the environmentalists are wrong. And then you kind of come and you go through the list of all these places. And of course, there's like this thing that we weren't really talking about that's at the center of all of them, which is that they all do it by basically doing sort of state-led deployment of nuclear energy. So that's the kind of moment where we're like, okay, we can't, we kind of knew that nuclear was out there and people would always ask us about it. And we're always like, well, I don't know, we're trying to kind of move this whole environmental movement. And finally, we're like, okay, we can't keep pretending like the evidence for the places that really have kind of pretty successfully and deeply cut their emissions, at least in the electrical sector, is not like pretty centrally a story about nuclear energy. We kind of start talking about it. We put some papers where we kind of made nuclear part of the solution. And then, in February of 2011, I went to Yale. It was, 7 plus, maybe 6-7 years after the death of environmentalism. And we'd been given an invitation to go to the Yale, what's now called the Environmental School, but it used to be called the Forestry School, and kind of give a talk. We'd gone there right after death of environmentalism and done this big kind of thing. So we go there and I write this speech, and it's called The Long Death of Environmentalism. And it's sort of looking back even then, which wasn't that far ago at that point. And it's kind of like, here's the key things that we've learned, and here's the key things going forward. And we had these like 10 or 12 theses for sort of the new post-environmental politics. And one of them, it's like really the first time that we come out and we're like really, really clearly sort of unambiguously like the environmental community needs to get serious about nuclear energy. So we kind of give that, and we give that speech, and this kind of gets noticed by a bunch of people, that we're not just sort of saying, yeah, there's a little bit of nuclear over here, but we're like kind of like, this is one of the things that's really critical to the future. And then like literally like, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks later, Fukushima happens. There's like a lot of people who are kind of like, ha ha, joke's on you, you said nuclear, and now look, there's this terrible catastrophe. And I think the reaction for us, as with a lot of people, is, a lot of the early nuclear advocates was like actually like looking at it and being like, okay, like this is the kind of this is sort of the test of like, if you're serious about nuclear, is if you're ready to defend it in the middle of a meltdown. I think if you look at a bunch of the early folks, Stuart Brand, Mark Linus, me and Breakthrough, we're all like, no, actually, like, yeah, this is an accident. This is a serious industrial accident, but it is literally not the end of the world. It's happening in the midst of this kind of terrible natural disaster, in which, 20,000 people died in this disaster. And none of them died from the nuclear meltdown, even though Fukushima is now synonymous with the meltdown and not a tsunami that swept across much of northern Japan, wiped out, in the entire region and killed 20,000 people. I think like in some ways, the kind of birth of the modern pro-nuclear movement actually is Fukushima. Ironically, because it's sort of like, again, it's this moment where you're like, okay, like if we're serious about this, we need to actually sort of talk back to the catastrophizing, knee-jerk kind of freak out catastrophizing that's happening. So we did that, and we did it probably more publicly than kind of anyone else at that moment. And we like kind of opened a whole part of our website where we were like actually really tracking like the radiological doses and explaining to people what they meant. And at the same time being like, yeah, this actually, like the media and the environmental community are taking the wrong lessons from this.
What
think
that they were taking?
Well, their lessons were, this proves we can't do nuclear. It's far too dangerous. And we're like, no, it's actually not that dangerous. There's a massive overreaction going on here, from the Japanese government, among others. And that's not to say that there's not something here that we need to deal with. But like, if you put this in the context of, energy, the realities of just energy production globally, this is a relatively mild problem to have to deal with. And it's happening in this one particular place. And, if you're rational about it and you don't evacuate the entire population, like it's a manageable problem. And we should handle it the way, again, like, I live, a few miles from, a set of major refineries here in the San Francisco Bay Area. They have accidents and toxic pollution releases all of the time. And we don't evacuate the city of Richmond every time it happens, or insist that we have to end refining of all petroleum products, which, like, if you're serious about climate change, sooner or later you need to do. Like we just don't. That's not the reaction to this thing that, like, just sort of, just purely from any kind of rational public health perspective, you would go, that's a much more serious accident than even like Fukushima. And then from there, like, we start really kind of leaning into nuclear, doing a lot of analysis, sort of like just running the numbers on, the closure of the San Onofre plant, in something where it's like you close it and everyone's like, the environmental groups and Friends of the Earth are all like, no, we're going to replace it all with renewable energy. And then, of course, emissions go through the roof, and Germany's closing plants after Fukushima, and the same thing has happened, and Japan shuts down and their emissions go through the roof. And we're documenting all of that. And at the same time, we're also sort of like kind of talking about what the options are in terms of new nuclear technologies that maybe look somewhat different than the ones that sort of everyone has been accustomed to over the last generation. So, you kind of get to the end of that, a few years later with a set of the folks who, were kind of really early, very public, sort of non-industry pro-nuclear advocates. And we write and publish the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which really kind of puts sort of all of that thinking around clean, cheap, abundant energy, the understanding environmental problems as fundamentally technological problems, and understanding technology as the sort of critical fulcrum that mediates the relationship between human well-being and material well-being and environmental protection of all sorts, and then nuclear energy being really at the center of that challenge, and nuclear being a really critical energy technology that will be necessary to, kind of sustain large, modern human civilizations while kind of dealing with climate change and other environmental challenges. So I'll stop there because that was a while. That was long.
It's all right.
It's been a long journey.
I mean, you've been a part of so many different aspects of the environmental movement, and it has changed a lot in the last 20 years, especially as people have become more aware of climate change and the effect that it has on their lives. More people are talking about it. You have newer perspectives, new solutions. We talk about those for a while. We try to figure it out. We still have a lot of work to do to figure out which solutions will work in the future. But yeah, there's a couple of things I'd like to respond to in terms of your journey. First of all, it seems that writing has been a really key part of your career, of you building this brand. You said that you were kind of in this new era of TED. I mean, the death of environmentalism was one of the first times that I think you had articulated a lot of those ideas. Why do you think writing has such a central part of your career in advancing these ideas?
I mean, yeah, I think that it just inevitably, kind of, sort of thoughts and ideas precede action. And especially if you're trying to do something different or new, you've got to kind of work it out conceptually and intellectually. And, there's kind of labels of thought leadership or whatever, and it's easy to make fun of, but it's also really important. So it takes us, I had spent a lot of years in the environmental movement in various roles. I sort of privately had just increasingly become very frustrated, very concerned, kind of being like, what the hell are we doing? And why is it that everyone believes this thing when I can just kind of look at various aspects of it and go, that doesn't really make sense. So, the first step before you can have a real politics or a real policy agenda, or, there's a whole kind of grassroots, eco-modernist and pro-nuclear movement. And you can't really have any of that before you have sort of the ideas. And so, the ideas always have to come first. Again, especially if you're kind of in politics, trying to kind of do something new and something different. And so you have to go, the writing is essential to that. So, today at Breakthrough, we have a Washington office, we have a whole team. I think you guys did something with Adam Stein recently, who leads our nuclear innovation program, who are literally at the NRC, every day, sort of being independent civil society, pro-nuclear advocates for kind of sensible regulatory policy. You couldn't, there was no demand for that. There was not actually really, we're a decade into sort of renewed public policy to try to kind of support advanced nuclear technologies. And there's a whole set of policies that, haven't kind of necessarily hit the headlines, but that have been really important for that. And that all happens for a long time before there's really a lot to go to the NRC and advocate for. And for even all that policy to happen, we had to kind of be out just making the case that we needed nuclear. That it was a critical climate technology. And, when we did our first big nuclear report in 2013, 2014, it was called How to Make Nuclear Cheap. And, it was kind of like, we had like 100 congressional staffers who came to this briefing we organized because they were just like, what's this nuclear thing? I thought nuclear was not something. And here's an environmental group that's saying we need new nuclear. And then we literally go to the Department of Energy and we meet with the guy who runs DOE's advanced nuclear office. And, he's got it's like a one guy at the end of his career sitting in a room with a $25 million budget, which is just nothing. And, it was sad, he's kind of like, yeah, I spent my whole career here and it doesn't work out and it'll never happen. It was like, if you talk to that guy, you would be like, advanced nuclear is never going to happen. And we went and got a meeting with the head of the Obama White House's Center for Council on Environmental Quality. And they're like, what is advanced? They'd literally never heard of it. Within a couple of years, they're sort of putting some real resources into advanced nuclear at DOE and in the Obama administration. That continues through the Trump administration. It's now a kind of major commitment of the Biden administration, in the Biden administration. So, but all of that, none of that can happen until someone is writes something and is like, hey, here's the case for advanced nuclear. Here's why we need it. Here's why we need to reconsider the role of nuclear, given everything that we know today versus what people thought in 1978. So yeah, the writing and the thought leadership and the ideation, it's critical. And we continue to do that at Breakthrough, not just me, but our team, because it's how you kind of stay out. And it's not just about advocating for things you already believe in, but I think, we try to always have a really sort of critical culture where we're always trying to kind of stay out in front of where the sort of discourse or the debate is now. And that's how, we kind of keep ourselves from getting really sort of ossified, and sort of too kind of set in our ways as well.
I would say it's also certainly probably lent to your ability to go viral, as you put it earlier. Even with your very first publication, what was it like to kind of be caught in that viral moment when the death of environmentalism took off? And then,
well, it was kind of crazy because there weren't viral moments then. Yeah. So it was sort of like, what the hell is happening? But suddenly people are emailing from all over the world. Again, this was before social media at all. So it's kind of, but it's all happening, all prior. It's just sort of like early blogging days, really. So, there's a lot happening on blogs and a bunch of the sort of big, all the sort of big, kind of legacy, Atlantic, New Republic, places like that are all just launching digital platforms and publishing their content digitally. And you have sort of a set of the first bloggers, associated with a set of these outlets who are kind of writing about it. And you're getting, I was not a public figure at all until that essay. And suddenly I'm getting, invitations to come give speeches at universities and, places like Yale and Princeton and, from all over the world. And it was a little, it took a while to be like, oh, okay, this is different. This is not, being an environmental organizer or a campaign consultant or a pollster. I'm doing something different now. And it took a while to figure that out.
What lessons did you take away from some of those earlier moments that you apply to your life as a public figure now? People pay attention to the things that you say because of some of those earlier moments.
I don't know. I think one of the I think the biggest thing is like if you're going to go say something that make an argument, you know, and kind of be clear. I think a lot of people, you know, especially when they're right, and I find this, you know, like people want to be experts, and the expert writes in a different way than a thought leader writes. And you can be an expert and a thought leader, but they're not the same thing. Sorry, what?
What do you consider yourself? An
An
expert or a thought leader, or both?
Definitely a thought leader, sort of an, you know, I'm kind of an, you know, like I'm not like a PhD, you know, energy systems modeler or nuclear engineer, and I don't claim to be. You know, I'm a guy with a BA in history from UC Berkeley. But you know, like there's a kind of and I don't want to, you know, sort of dismiss expertise. It's really important and it's valuable, but there's also just a lot of stuff that gets obfuscated by expertise, where kind of, you know, you get in, like I always tell, you know, one of the things I always tell my staff is like, you know, before we get to the, like, let's kind of create a really complicated model or, you know, like just like kind of let's do some descriptive, you know, what they call descriptive statistics here. Like if you can't just kind of put in a pretty simple spreadsheet and look at it and be like, there's a relationship here, or there's a noticeable trend here. You can go and like be like, well, no, you know, we used to see this in like, for instance, all the arguments about like how effective actually in the real world is putting a price on carbon. And, you know, or how effective has sort of climate policy been. You know, you would go look at, for instance, like the carbon intensity of energy, you know, before, you know, then sort of 1990, when sort of everyone starts really paying attention to carbon, because it's as climate change is really kind of coming into view, or before 97 when the Kyoto Accord is done, or you could time these different points, and in a lot of cases, sort of the carbon intensity of energy falls faster in the era prior to sort of the beginnings of climate policy than after. You know, and you don't need like a kind of you know, very complicated, you know, integrated assessment model to see it. And people would go, well, no, but like you haven't controlled for like the 17 different factors. And like, you know, you get people like when we'd have these debates with people, the cap and trade and carbon pricing people, after like the European emissions trading system went into place, and everyone's like, no, the emissions trading system, this is what we should be doing. And we're kind of like, well, but except it doesn't seem to be having any impact on emissions. And they'd be like, well, that's because of all these other factors, but we have this very complicated model and we've kind of totally controlled it, and you know, controlled for every factor that we can think of. And when we do that, we can find a statistically significant impact, as theory suggests, of the price on carbon on emissions. And it's kind of like, well, even if that's true, if like the impact is so minimal that you just can't actually see it in the basic like descriptive statistics, you know, with sort of some basic, and you know, like the carbon intensity of energy does kind of control for economic growth rates and things like that. So if you can't see it in these sort of really kind of basic, using these very basic metrics, whether or not it exists, it's just not very significant. You know, there's a corollary to this in the nuclear space, right? Which is like, you know, there's these debates about like linear no threshold, and is, you know, like what is the impact of like really low level, low dose radiation exposures on human health, and is it bad, and does it go all the way to zero, and there's cancer and bad things that go all the way there, or is it the opposite? Is there hormesis and low levels are really good for you? But the truth is, it's actually like an unfalsifiable argument, because literally you're talking about, it cannot be resolved empirically, because the impact, whether it's positive or negative, is so minimal that you can't actually observe it in even a very, very large exposed population. It's just too small of an effect to be able to sort of see it in a statistically significant way against the sort of background cancer rate, mortality rates, whatever metric you use. And people are like, okay, well, so what do we do? And I'm sort of like, well, I don't actually care. Like if I can't see it, if the effect one way or another is so minimal that you literally can't observe it in the real world, this is not a serious public health concern. Hundreds of thousands of people just in the United States that die every day from exposure to every year from exposure to conventional air pollutants. Like, that's an effect that we can see, we can track. There's no debate about this. Why are we talking about low dose radiation? It's just not significant enough for anyone to be concerned about it at all, much less for us to have an entire, federal regulatory framework predicated on mitigating theoretical public health risk, which is actually what the NRC is mostly doing at this point.
Do you find that in your advocacy for nuclear energy, that's one of the major issues that people will push back on? And that you're
it's sort of, people don't push back on it; they just assume it. And my view and our, we're like, no, actually, this is a problem. We need to stop doing this, because in sort of innumerable ways, as you get actually into the nuclear sort of regulatory and the ways in which, in obvious and not so obvious ways, it imposes very substantial costs on nuclear technology that no other technology bears. It's really because of this sort of radical conservatism in the regulatory environment around sort of regulating entirely theoretical public health risk.
So
my point about that on the expertise on all these cases, expertise can get in the, a kind of expertise can get in the way. And I think part of what differentiates thought leadership is to kind of cut through some of that and kind of actually like there are expert communities that have a lot of perverse incentives on both sides of the issue to kind of endlessly debate the linear no threshold hypothesis and hormesis. And it's literally a debate that is totally irrelevant to public health. And it obscures the real question, which is, why do we care at these levels of theoretical risk? So thought leadership is doing something different. Thought leadership goes, we shouldn't care about this. And here's why. And it's a very sort of fact-based and empirically grounded argument. And in this case, the empirics is like, it's literally impossible to see an effect.
So do you find that this like pragmatism that you kind of speak to, has that been a key part of like your thought evolution regarding nuclear energy in particular? Like you had mentioned that this was like a solution you saw when you were looking at how other countries abroad were reducing their emissions, but how has like your perspective on nuclear energy shifted since then?
You kind of come to it from a kind of pragmatic, but once you get your head around it, of course, it was completely consistent with our broader view of kind of climate change, particularly, and which is like, here's a technology that, it's a kind of a critical technology. It's a technology that sort of the kind of traditional mainstream environmental community has not just rejected, but as a sort of essentially attempted to sort of regulate and fearmonger out of existence. It's and then as we kind of dive more into understanding why nuclear has these unique characteristics, a lot of the kind of ideas in the eco-modernist manifesto come out of kind of wrapping our heads around nuclear to start with, the value of sort of density, shrinking the footprint, as opposed, if you look at like the sort of nuclear the sort of prototype in mental model of kind of nuclear as an environmental technology versus renewables. You know, you go to the opening line of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, and it says like, you know, there's sort of two environmental ideas that are actually totally inconsistent with one another. One is shrinking the human footprint, and the other is sort of harmonizing the sort of provision of human material well-being with nature and with sort of natural energy flows. And so renewable energy is this idea that you're going to kind of gently capture the existing natural flows, and human societies will sort of support themselves by capturing these natural energy flows. And nuclear is really kind of predicated on, like, you know, digging uranium out of the ground, refining it, splitting atoms to create, you know, to unleash this energy that is otherwise sort of not accessible. And because it's such a powerful source of energy, and it's not dependent on these natural energy flows, you know, you can kind of meet human needs on this tiny footprint, land use footprint, material footprint, all of those things. Like that, you know, like that's literally like the third sentence or something in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. And, you know, it's an insight that comes right from thinking about what, you know, why nuclear is different than, you know, these other clean energy sources, and brings kind of has different characteristics and quite different possibilities for human societies if you fully kind of utilize it.
To that point, I mean, if you actually consider what in reality it takes to capture solar and wind energy, it's still just as much of a intensive process because of the mining and manufacturing that goes into producing technology as well. So it is,
yeah, all of which gets sort of airbrushed out of the picture of these nice little spinning windmills and this. I mean, you kind of go and you look at the sort of, again, the prototypical, and you see it in the sort of, you know, call it marketing, propaganda, whatever, and it's always like a hand drawing of like a, you know, it's a bucolic landscape of like sort of suburban homes with solar panels on them, and then beautiful sort of organic small scale farms with windmills spinning in them, and then there's all this nature everywhere. There's mountains in the background, and there's, you know, animals wandering around everywhere. And, you know, the reality of it, you know, because my family's originally from New Mexico, and so I live in California. We go to New Mexico every year, and we drive out there. We go out through the Tehachapi Desert. And let me tell you, the reality of industrial scale renewable energy looks nothing like that. The scale of it on the landscape. I mean, you come out of into the sort of coming back to California, and you come in through the Mojave Desert into the Tehachapi Mountains, which is one of the windiest places in California. And it's just it's massive wind farms as far as the eye can see. And then, you know, you kind of come over and get into the Mojave, and you go a little further, and then like you come over these little, you know, into these valleys, and it's just literally the entire valley is a solar farm. And you know, to do this at the scale that anyone's talking about, there's going to have to be vastly more of that. So, you know, the kind of prototype of this sort of renewable energy future and the realities of it, you know, and that's before we kind of start talking, as you said, you know, about the cobalt in you know, Africa, and the, you know, slave labor in China, and on and on. And it's not that nuclear hasn't had some of those problems, but the scale of it is totally different when you try to do this with, you know, just purely with the sun and the wind, and just sort of harnessing these natural flows. And it then actually kind of implicates, I mean, if you look at the math on like what 100% global variable renewable energy system looks like, you're just like, it's basically the size of global agriculture today in terms of its land use, which, global agriculture is by far the largest, most significant human impact on the environment. And so it's like, let's double that to do it with renewables, and, to be clear, unlike some people in the nuclear advocacy space, we're not anti-renewables. We think there's a significant role for renewables to play. But when you go from like, it's one source of clean energy among a number of others to like, we're going to do it all with variable renewable energy, just the environmental consequences of that are just enormous. And we're only just now beginning to kind of come to terms with that.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason I bring that up is just because it is interesting, like with the public narrative around renewables versus something like nuclear energy, which has, an even better possibility of reducing emissions and just increasing energy access. But one thing that I'm curious about is how and granted, I do think that nuclear energy is getting, we've discussed like the concept of a renaissance. It is definitely increasing in popularity among like in public polling. And that's very exciting to see. But how do we kind of get nuclear energy to get the same kind of treatment that renewable energy does, where people see it as this real, like, where there's real optimism surrounding growing nuclear energy? And I think that's true among some groups, but it's definitely not widespread yet. So how do we bridge that gap to get environmentalists to understand like this could be a really, really great way forward?
I mean, I think there's a kind of part of the environmental community that honestly is just going to have to die. Back to the death of environmentalism, and I say that literally, like there's a generation that is just never going to come around on nuclear, and they came, in the environmental movement, that came of age, in the 60s, 70s. Granted,
there were much scarier aspects.
I don't know if you saw, someone put up this picture, side-by-side picture of like the anti-Diablo kind of people, group and the pro-Diablo group, like literally pictures of like a bunch of the key people. And it's like, literally, it's completely generational.
I can empathize with the idea of growing up during the threat of nuclear war. Like, I'm very lucky that was not something I grew up with.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about climate change as an existential crisis, but
exactly.
Global nuclear holocaust is a whole different animal.
So I have empathy there, but like we do have a bridge to gap.
Yeah, and if you were doing like duck and cover in the 50s in elementary school, that leaves an impression.
2023.
Yeah, it's like we're 70 years later, and it's a different world. I mean, I think the biggest thing though is like we gotta put some steel in the ground. It's all fine and well to sort of talk about this great nuclear renaissance and all the benefits and how it's great and we need it and blah blah blah, but you got to get it built, and you got to demonstrate that there's sort of new nuclear technologies that at least have sort of potential to scale. And it's one thing to kind of, build paper reactors and put that into a spreadsheet. And it's another thing to actually build a real reactor and have anyone look at it and go like, let's do that again. The industry has a history of over-promising and under-delivering. Part of that history is tied up with this insane regulatory framework that it's been saddled with, particularly since the kind of creation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So, my view is that we got to kind of have some success stories. We've got to get some new nuclear technology commercialized. And I don't think we're going to be successful doing that unless we fix the NRC. So that is the thing that we've been sort of laser focused on the last couple of years. We got to this point where there's like real technology, real companies that are trying to like actually license new technology so they can go build it at the NRC. And it is going to be very difficult given the current regulatory framework that we have. Until we get that changed, I don't think that nuclear is going to be able to sort of deliver on the promise that a lot of us believe it needs to deliver on.
So your priority now is kind of modernizing the NRC, so to speak. What methods are you trying to pursue in order to do that?
Well, Congress directed the NRC to do this, and it has not gone well thus far. So, in 2019, Congress passed something called the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, directing the NRC to create what's called a risk-informed, performance-based pathway for licensing advanced non-light water reactors. 4 years later, and basically what the NRC staff did, and this is kind of a sign of a kind of pretty dysfunctional institution, is in response to that mandate, they just sort of basically cut and pasted the existing frameworks for large light water reactors and put them into their new proposed rule. And they sort of kind of changed some language to make it ostensibly technology neutral, but it's basically the same old regulatory framework, designed for large light water reactors, that the staff says this should be the framework for small, advanced, and non-light water reactors as well. We spent a lot of time kind of in that process, sort of in public comment, engaging the NRC staff, organizing stakeholders to be like, don't do this. You need to actually kind of start with a clean sheet of paper here. The staff was unwilling to do that. About, 8-9 months ago, when the first sort of draft that was going to go to the 5 appointed commissioners was kind of went public, we went public and said, this is going to be trouble. And anyone who's counting, on a sort of bold new future, brave new future for nuclear energy, should not bet on that if this is the framework that the NRC is going to use to license advanced reactors. That got a lot of attention. A bunch of people wrote about it after we kind of put our analysis and sort of, again, did our thought leadership, whatever you want to call it. Washington Post editorialized and said, this is a problem. It got the attention, importantly, of a number of key Democratic senators who become pro-nuclear. And so, I think that the 5 commissioners, or really it's 4 right now, are sort of trying to figure out what to do with that. I think hopefully they are going to sort of send that draft rule back to the staff with very clear direction from the commission that the staff needs to kind of make very significant changes to this framework. At the same time, there's sort of increasing sort of appetite in Congress to take further sort of legislative statutory action to reform the NRC, including things like changing, amending the NRC's mission to make clear. It's always been clear in the statute, but the NRC has ignored it, that the NRC needs to consider the benefits of nuclear energy for public health, for climate change particularly, and not just sort of try to kind of eliminate all risk associated with low-level radiation release at the plant level, which is really the mission that the NRC kind of insists is, despite the fact that there's no basis for it in the statute, the NRC insists that this is their mission. So those two things are happening. There's also like a fight right now over the reappointment of Jeff Barron, who has been a commissioner. This would be his, if he's the Biden administration submitted him for reappointment, went through the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee on a straight party line vote. But Barron is sort of like the last real sort of Democratic obstructionist commissioner on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was the last commissioner placed on the commission by Harry Reid, who was the very powerful president of the Senate for many years and was from Nevada. And so was basically kind of like no new nuclear, no kind of anything to help the industry until there's a long-term waste solution and it's not in Nevada. And so this sort of Yucca Mountain controversy literally for like a generation dominated the Democratic sort of all Democratic sort of thought and action related to the NRC. We still need a solution. It's not actually an urgent problem. We have the waste is totally safe. It's stored on site. It can be stored there for a very long time. I think we will figure out a solution, but the future of advanced nuclear energy, should not be held hostage by kind of the ghost of Yucca Mountain. And that's what Jeff Barron really is. That's why he's on the commission. That's why he was put on the commission. Everything has radically changed since he was put on the commission. The Biden administration is sort of full bore ahead. We need nuclear. Congress, Democrats in Congress appropriating huge amounts of money to sort of demonstrate new reactors. And at the same time, like none of that is going to happen if we don't fix the NRC. So the Democrats need to like put someone, they've made a couple of appointments. There are two other Democratic commissioners. I don't always agree with them, but they're, they take nuclear as a critical climate technology seriously in a way that Jeff Barron does not. So my message to all of your listeners would be call your senator, Democrat, Republican, whatever they are, and urge them to vote against the confirmation of Jeff Barron. This is just I think it's a kind of watershed moment particularly for Democrats in the Senate about whether they're really serious about nuclear and a future for advanced nuclear. And if you are serious about that, sort of job one, the very first thing is stop putting guys like Jeff Barron on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, full stop. So, those are the sort of Part 53 and the licensing of advanced reactor applications at the NRC, congressional action to take further action to fix the NRC, and the Barron confirmation. Those are sort of really the cutting edge of the sort of political battle to actually like make a nuclear future possible right now.
Thank you for delivering such a clear message. I feel like it's rare that we can really leave people with a strong action item. So I always appreciate clear instructions.
Yes. And you can find out much more about that and figure out how to reach out to your senator and that kind of thing at a website that we've launched with a number of the more grassroots pro-nuclear groups called Build Nuclear Now, okay. www.buildnuclearnow.org. Mothers for Nuclear Energy, Generation Atomic. I'm sure a bunch of the folks that you've had on this show before are partners and part of that effort. And people should go to that website, learn more both about the effort to fix the NRC and about the Barron confirmation, and let their representatives know that it's just unacceptable to put an obstructionist back on the NRC if you're serious about a future for nuclear energy.
And we certainly were very serious about it. So with that, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I hope you have a great one.
Yeah, great. Happy to do it. Enjoyed the conversation.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.